Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are watching this from. My name is John Romano. I'm the coordinator of the TAP network. I'm here today with our next installment of the TAP Network Conversations series with a good friend and colleague, Arleys Bellorini from World Vision. World Vision, of course, has been a strong supporter and member of TAP since the very beginning, since 2014. And I know Arelys very well, personally as well, good friends there over the years. Arelys, welcome. Thanks for joining us for this conversation. Before we get started, do you want to give just a few words about World Vision and the work that you do and the role that you see in your membership as part of TAP?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, John, for having me in this series of conversations that TAP Network is promoting. This is great work. We are member, as you say, we are member of TAP Network. We admire and respect very much the network and think that it has been doing a fantastic, outstanding job. World Vision is a child-focused organization, first of all. It is a Christian organization that works both on humanitarian and development. We work in over 100 countries. And actually this year is our 70th anniversary. Speaking of a year of anniversary, so for World Vision, this is 70 years. We were created in 1950. And ever since then, we have focused our work on children, the most vulnerable children in developing countries.
Okay, great. Yeah, and of course, 16.2 is, I'm sure, your favorite target.
Very critical, very important. And I still remember when we were working very strongly to push for that SDG 16 and from our end 16.2, but 16.2 cannot be, and the violence against children cannot be seen as isolated from the entire SDG 16, which needs to be a comprehensive and integrated approach toward the goal. I think that in today's shifted world, because our world has changed completely, the narrative that SDG 16 brings is even much more important. It was timely then, it was important then, but today it's the context actually ratifies the urgency and the need for a framework that SDG 16 offers on some of the foundational aspects of a society in order to be peaceful, in order to ensure the citizens of a country happy living, living in well-being, living in faith, and living in development.
You know, we've talked over the years about how much things have changed, especially when it comes to SDG 16 issues, from when the SDGs were adopted in 2015 and where we are today. A lot has changed in many countries and many contexts around the world, and obviously with the COVID-19 context this year. But I'm wondering, from your perspective, what are some of the biggest challenges that we face? You mentioned that, you know, the context is completely different. What are some of the biggest challenges that we've seen? I mean, it's been 5 years. It's been quite a long 5 years, yeah. I think, in a lot of ways for many of us. But in your view, what's changed the most? What are some of the big challenges that you see? And then thinking about how we go from here over the next decade, how can we make things better? How can we improve SDG 16 implementation?
Yes. I think back then and today, there were many challenges for the full implementation of the SDGs and achievement of SDG 16 in particular. I think that some of those challenges remain. For example, one of the challenge and threats on the SDGs was to implement them in silo. without an integrated approach, an interlinkage approach. I think that today that is a real threat, perhaps even more than before, because of the coronavirus disease. There are some aspects that have become much more evident, and even though they are rooted in deeper issues, I think that we run the risk that some SDGs might be addressed much more than others. So for example, health, education. I mean, health, for example, is very, very evident that there is an issue there, and that it has become much more evident now with the coronavirus disease. But the issue that we're having on this disease has to do with systems, which is much more deep-rooted. So if we address the effect rather than the root causes of it, then we will not be achieving the SDGs. And SDG 16 is core to addressing the root causes of the effect that we are facing. So yes, there is a greater challenge because there may be inclination to emphasize today more than ever some SDGs than others.
Yeah, I think it's a great point that the linkages that we always talk about between individual SDGs and others. We've been saying this from the very beginning. That was one of the original advocacy points that we had during the negotiations on the SDGs and SDG 16, was that SDG 16, we always said, underpinned the entire 2030 agenda, and SDG 16 was linked with every other SDG. And I think that's a great point, because I think we're now finding out in real life terms how SDG 16 matters when it comes to other things like public health, for example.
Exactly.
Why do we need strong institutions, and why do we need good governance and transparent governance to adequately respond to public health crises like this?
On the other hand, it creates opportunities. Some of those opportunities, because inequalities has been now projected in its full view, I think the issue of justice comes much more to the forefront. So there are opportunities within those challenges. And I think that from the civil society perspective, it is those opportunities that we should be looking at and trying to work on that momentum, where it's not only us saying what might happen, but actually we are looking at what exactly can happen.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, we can stretch this conversation to talk about all of SDG 16 targets and how it relates to the current crisis. But even, for example, like the global ceasefire that's been called for by the Secretary General and many other groups around the world, it's the recognition that, when we have a crisis like this, a very real and imminent public health crisis like this, our time and resources and focus of the global community need to be exactly on that, instead of trying to push back conflicts and other threats to peace around the world. It's that we need to come together and focus on these issues instead of the many other things that the UN traditionally tries to cover at the global level. And speaking of the global level, I mean, I know obviously that you've worked a lot around the UN over the years. You are one of TAP's go-to experts, and along with Together 2030, a network that you also have helped to create and sustain over the years. The HLPF and the HLPF review process is important to you, and Together 2030 as well. So I wanted to get your thoughts and reflections on, where your reflections on the General Assembly this year. Of course, it was a big year, the 75th anniversary of the UN signing of the UN Charter. in the context of the pandemic, if we thought that General Assembly participation and civil society participation was limited when there were physical meetings, I think many of us found it really challenging to engage digitally as well. And I think the same thing applies for the 2020 HLPF as well. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts on participation and the outcomes of the UN General Assembly, UN 75, and also looking a little bit back towards July in the HLPF? Are there similarities? What are some of your reflections on participation and engagement of civil society in all these?
Yes. So on participation, it has been interesting to observe the emphasis on numbers of people participating, people who joined. And we can see in the website of HLPF that it says that I think 125,000 people viewed HLPF. I mean, it's a very important figure. But we need to go back also to our roots as civil society. And for us, it hasn't been about numbers. It has been about quality. It has been about meaningful engagement. It has been about meaningful participation. It has been about sitting at the table, providing our inputs and recommendations to be taken on board. So if we go back to our roots of what our advocacy has been from the civil society perspective, we're quite far from that. Again, I want to emphasize, it's not about the numbers. It is about what we have always advocated on, which is to be at the table, providing inputs that are captured by the policymakers, by global decision makers. That has not happened. To be connected to web TV, UN web TV, doesn't allow for that meaningful participation. I don't want to minimize the fact that it was important that so many thousands of people were able to view, to watch the proceedings. On the other hand, it also caught my attention that we don't have the figures from previous years. So we were not really able to compare whether this year that 125,000 are more than in previous years or are less. We are thinking that is more because we are given that figure. So again, meaningful participation of civil society. On that, we are very far. Actually, just as COVID-19 has exposed the weaknesses that we've been talking about for so many years about systems and governance and so on, the modality that has been adopted at the United Nations of virtual modality is also exposing the fact that there has always been an attempt not to let civil society in the room even. So today it is very challenging for civil society to be contributing directly to the resolutions, declarations, or statements being developed. And while we understand the circumstances and we understand that it has to be a virtual modality, but member states were clever enough to come up with solutions on how they can engage virtually. You know, they adopted resolutions on the modalities of decision making, on the modalities of their meetings, on the platform that they will use, etc., etc. However, no disposition was made regarding civil society participation into that sphere.
I mean, when it comes to the member states engaging with one another and with civil society, I think we also saw that the HLPF in particular lacked an outcome, the final declaration. So I think one of the challenges is that, from a civil society perspective, I completely agree that the quality of engagement is important, and it just, it's been difficult. But at the same time, I think also member states are struggling a little bit on, how to ensure, not just engaging with one another and having these virtual meetings, but how do we ensure that we're actually coming to outcomes? How do we ensure that the UN itself and the HLPF itself doesn't just stall and just say, okay, we're going to push pause for a year or two because of COVID-19 and then pick up where we left off? These are important years, and whether or not we face a public health crisis collectively shouldn't give us this, or diminish our expectations for what the HLPF and what we collectively should deliver when we have these really important opportunities to convene globally around the SDGs. So I'm curious, when it comes to concretely, what does this look like? Do you have any ideas for concretely, like what can we ask of governments and ask of the UN system to improve the quality of engagement? And how do we ensure that civil society is not just able to follow the discussions, but also, again, actively contribute, as you said, as maybe not equal partners, but at least engage in the ways that we traditionally have when we have had in-person meetings. So any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think you're just going back a little bit on the outcomes. It was a major missed opportunity for HLPF not to have a ministerial declaration. And if we see the modalities that the member states have adopted regarding on-site voting, I think that was something that could have also taken place with the ministerial declaration, because it was a pivotal moment for the ministers to have a declaration very strongly behind the SDGs, very strongly on the impact of COVID-19. So the way forward, I think there are different modalities that member states can explore regarding civil society. So one of them is, just as they are having informal consultations on specific resolutions and they are connecting via Zoom or via WebEx, we could also be part of those. We could also be presenting at those meetings, and small meetings with different groups of member states could actually be organized to enable and to facilitate that dialogue between civil society and member states, as well as presentation of our written inputs, but for those inputs to be taken into account, to be discussed between civil society and member states. So I think there is definitely innovation that could really be applied here, and we can really come up with very good, strong and solid ways of participating and engaging.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point too. Is one of the things that we have heard from many civil society colleagues that engaged in the HLPF in particular was that it was great because the virtual means of engagement allowed groups that weren't otherwise able to attend the HLPF in previous years because the cost of travel and visas of trying to get to New York are quite expensive, and sometimes it's just not possible. So it allowed a little bit more in terms of the types of organizations that could follow the HLPF, which I think is a positive thing, as you mentioned. But I think one of the opportunities here, as you were saying, is that if we do improve the means of engagement in the HLPF, we then also allow voices that traditionally haven't been heard from in the HLPF processes up to this point. We allow those voices to come to the table as well. I mean, I think there's a lot to be said about how the HLPF and these big UN meetings, sometimes we attract the usual suspects. We see a lot of the same organizations attending some of these meetings and providing their feedback, which is great. But I think it's also, this gives us an opportunity to kind of broaden the scope of the organizations that the UN can engage with. And in a lot of ways, working with a network like TAP or like Together 2030, that is our way of civil society of trying to bring some of those voices from the grassroots level and then feed it up into the global level where you and I engage around the UN. So I think there's an opportunity there as well that we can't neglect going forward.
Absolutely. I think that's the opportunity that you refer to with groups that do not usually come to New York, either because of visa issues or because of the expense that it requires and so on. We're able. I wouldn't be so enthusiastic about we're able to view because, like I said, HLPF has always been on web TV, but rather we're able to convene their events virtually. And even if, you know, maybe not 100% of the audience was the target audience that we're wanting to reach, but at the very least, they were able to share their views on specific issues across a variety of groups, including other members of civil society from other countries, from other regions. So that brought some a substantive engagement, a substantive opportunity to share their views. But I would like to see those opportunities of colleagues who do not usually travel here to be able to speak at HLPF. For example, to be able to be part of the panels. And if we look again at the numbers, they're talking about 125 panelists. I would like to see how many of those panelists, I would like to disaggregate that data because, you know, we are about disaggregating data. How many of those panelists are the usual or the non-usual suspects? You know, how many people did we reach in each? I mean, was there any panelists, you know, from countries who have connectivity issues, or were we reaching out to countries that would have no issues with connectivity, for example? I mean, we know that only about 57% of the global population has access to internet. So, and we also know which are the countries, and these are the poorest countries that do not have that access. Those colleagues did not have access to are not part of the 125,000.
Yeah, and I mean, your point about, yeah, the composition of the panels, for example, I think the excuse that we often hear from, you know, the UN and member states is that, you know, there's only so many opportunities, and there's only so many opportunities to bring people to New York to actually physically participate in a meeting. I think that excuse now we know is gone, because we know that colleagues can now participate and engage in a virtual manner. So I think it's up to us going forward to ensure that we're holding the UN system and member states, holding them accountable to ensure that, you know, going forward, we have to have more inclusion and we have to have better representation from those groups that haven't been traditionally heard from in physical meetings of the HLPF. So exactly. I think it's also great that we now can very firmly say that there are no more excuses. You know, going forward, we have to.
And I think that civil society, we actually really optimize that opportunity. I can tell you from World Vision perspective, in previous years, we have always had challenges bringing a good number of children, for example, and we would invite, you know, 2 or 3 children. But, you know, we had one event where we had 8 children from across regions. So that was an opportunity that these young people had that would not have had otherwise. And I think other organizations as well, you know, inviting panelists that they would not usually have on site here in New York. But again, we would like to see the UN agencies, for example, optimize that opportunity like that. We would like to see the official sessions and official panels that they convene, the different labs that are convened to be much more mindful of reaching out to those voices.
Yeah, and I think this all kind of speaks to the connection between the global level at the HLPF or General Assembly, whatever it may be, these global discussions that we always have, And what kind of an added value does it provide to colleagues that work on the ground, the colleagues that work with their national governments or at the grassroots level? What's the meaning? What kind of added value does the HLPF provide? And how can we ensure that we're not just getting these feedbacks from the ground up, but from the HLPF down? What kind of value does it provide? So I'm keen to get your thoughts on, how can we ensure that that bridge between the global level and the national and local level, how do we ensure that there is a link, and how do we provide value on both ends, from the bottom up, but also from the HLPF down? Do you have any thoughts on that, especially given World Vision's presence in, I think you said, over 100 countries?
Yes, well, actually, that's where organizations and platforms like TAP and Together 2030 and organizations like World Vision that have this wide presence across a good number of countries come and can play a role on this. I think that's the process leading up to HLPF that takes place at national level and at sub-national level is critical. And when we come to HLPF, that is what we should be looking at, not just the reports that are launched and the presentations that are made in panels and so on, but rather how the process that led up to HLPF was advanced. So yeah, at national level and subnational level, there are a number of platforms working on SDGs, and they work very strongly on with the government about the VNR report. Sometimes they are successful in their work with the governments. Sometimes they are not. So how we bring those voices? How do we bring all the perspectives that they have, that these groups are presenting to the governments, and that are or are not taken on board to the global level, so that the discussion here is enriched by that perspective, and that we shine a light, we shine a spotlight on the issues that are being raised at national and subnational level. We should be looking at how citizen-driven data has been incorporated in the VNR, and if not, we should provide a space here in New York, or be it virtual and be it on site, to elevate those important evidence that can be brought from the local to global. So that just as an example. But I think that we can play a role, an important role on that. But I think also that HLPF itself, the governments and the Bureau of HLPF can really be mindful and very decisive on that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's actually a great point you make, that the HLPF in a lot of ways is the culmination of a process. We always call the HLPF the apex of the UN system on sustainable development. But I think the HLPF is also the end result of a process. As you mentioned, there are VNR processes, the voluntary national reviews, that countries that volunteer each year spend months leading up to that point, and hopefully engage with civil society in that process. I think spotlight reports, something that TAP has worked a lot on in the past and will continue to do so. I think that's a great point, that in the cases where we'll always call for governments to include civil society in the VNR process. That's a given. But one of the main questions that I have, and I'm keen to get your thoughts on this as well, is what do we do in a case where a government isn't being inclusive? So in many cases, there are countries and contexts where civic space is shrinking or it's non-existent. Some of those governments claim to engage with civil society. Some don't even make that claim at all. But what do we do? I mean, I know there's one thing to say about, shining a light on positive examples and best practices of how governments have worked with civil society. But what do we do about the cases where we know there's an issue? We know that civil society is suppressed in those particular countries. I still don't have a perfect answer to this as well, but I'm keen to get your thoughts on what about those difficult situations and circumstances and countries where civil society find themselves constantly under threat. Aside from like the spotlight reporting side of things, what do you think about, you know, how we can also approach some of those more difficult circumstances and make sure that civil society in those countries are heard?
I think we need to continue identifying those issues and trying to influence resolutions and declarations of the UN that are aimed at encouraging governments and calling on governments to to address that, to respect the human rights of its citizens, and to ensure, you know, the freedom of association, and to ensure all of those human rights that have to deal with the participation. It is a challenging task because in as much as we would like to also place a spotlight on that, and perhaps, you know, have people for colleagues from those countries participate in panels so that we can bring to light the issue. Sometimes that is challenging for them because it's an issue of, it's a big risk, because, you know, they are threatened at home, and they can, you know, their lives can be at stake. So we have to also take into account that's not in all occasions we are able to put a spotlight, because then that risk the very life of our colleagues. But I think that addressing the whole governance and human rights and justice issues is also that can impact positively toward addressing that issue. So basically saying it's part of a much more comprehensive issue and situation. And if we, in as much as we would like to address it in the on an isolated, we cannot isolate it, address it isolated cases, but we need to get at the root causes again, and that's the conviction of calling for respect on the human rights, and putting a spotlight on the violations of such rights can also contribute somehow to addressing the shrinking space.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I mean, we always talk about the linkages between human rights and the SDGs, and in particular SDG 16 specifically. And of course, the 2030 agenda, you know, states that the SDGs are founded within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And of course, I mean, I know that you and World Vision work a lot on the human rights processes and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. There are many other processes that are related to some of these issues around SDG 16 and the 2030 agenda. But I think one of the challenges, and I think we've seen this in practice over the years, is that there seems to be sometimes this kind of, you talked about operating in silos earlier. There seems to be this division, division might be a too strong of a word, but there seems to be this difference between the civil society groups that work on human rights and the ones that work traditionally on development. And the same thing for member states as well, the Geneva-focused member states and the missions, and the New York-based missions. And I think oftentimes we're doing things on separate tracks and then trying to connect them in between. But I think what's important for us, I mean, it's a great point about the human rights element here, is ensuring that both of these processes kind of speak to one another, and that we're drawing these connections from the beginning. I think we have, you know, a decade left to implement the SDGs. I think one of the things that we can do, in my opinion, is to ensure that we are going about both of these, the human rights and the development side of things. We're both going towards, you know, the same, we're guided by the same North Star, and ensuring that we bring these communities together. Because I think one of the challenges that we're going to face, and increasingly in this digitized and virtual world is that it's going to be increasingly more difficult to bring these groups together. And how do we actually do that when, you know, all we do now is just Zoom meetings, for example? So I think it's going to be even more challenging than it has been previously. But yeah, I'd be keen for your thoughts on, you know, how we can help do that, and maybe utilize organizations like your own that straddle both of these agendas, where you have a focus on the human rights side of things and the human rights conventions and treaties, but then also on the SDGs. So how can we learn from experiences with organizations that work on both tracks, so to speak?
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on how we can do that?
Well, my first thought is that we're still victim of the silos. It's been decades that we've been working in development with this silo approach. Civil society has also been part of that and coming out. We have the animals' participation is very important as well. We have so yeah, so it's going to be very difficult to come out of that, to break those silos, particularly in the context in which we are working now. But one thing that I can share with you, that from World Vision perspective, what we are trying to develop and advance much more when it comes to VNRs. So on VNRs, one of the things that we are always trying to work and discuss with governments and join that with other partners, we advance the idea about how children are featured in the VNR, because featuring children has to do with, you know, the commitments that they have on children, the delivery of the SDGs on children, based on, you know, what the promise of the 2030 agenda and so on, which goes to the core of the leave no one behind, because children are one of those groups that have been traditionally be left behind. So one of the things that we're trying to advance is to establish a linkage between the VNR reporting and the reporting in the context of the Child Rights Convention, and even more, the reporting in the Universal Periodic Review. So we, for example, right now we are developing some guidelines on how to take the CRC, the Child Rights Convention reporting, the report that is produced by the government, and the report that they're going to produce on VNR, and how to make the linkage, and how to analyze what is it being said here, what is it being said here, there, and the other one. So it's a little bit of going deeper into the accountability aspect, accountability, but also tracking progress.
Yeah.
Because we have found in the early review that we've done is that there are governments that are reporting good progress on CRC, but then when it comes to VNR, they don't even mention it. But on the other hand, we are also seeing, things that are not being implemented, and that they are actually committed not only in the CRC, but also in the 2030 agenda. So I think it is very important, and here I think civil society can play a very important role into establishing that linkage of the three, of the VNR, the UPR, and the particular and different international instruments. In our case, because we focused on children's rights, we have focused on the CRC, but a much more comprehensive engagement on that could actually, go into other international instruments. It's something that we actually had a recent conversation with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, because I think they can also play a role on that.
Yeah, and all of this is these are really great points. One of the things that we as TAP are working on in the months ahead is we're updating the content of our Goal 16 advocacy toolkit. And this is one of the issues that we're going to cover, is how to ensure that we're utilizing existing work around different processes, including the UN human rights, the treaty body processes and the reports to those bodies. How do we make sure that we're bringing it all together? But I want to just as a kind of a final strand of conversation, you mentioned accountability, and we've talked a lot about reporting and the reporting processes and reports themselves. But reports are only as good as, the content in the reports themselves and the processes to get there. But reports are only useful in the sense that they're information. They're the data that tells us generally where we are. But accountability, I think, is completely different. Reports can be part of the accountability puzzle, but accountability is a more active, it's a more active responsibility and role, particularly of civil society. So I'm curious from your perspective. World Vision is also part of the advisory group of the Campaign for a Decade of Accountability for the SDGs, which TAP has helped to spearhead over this past year and a half or so. So I'm curious about your thoughts on the accountability aspect of things. Where do we stand currently, and what can we do to improve? Particularly from a civil society perspective, what can we do to help improve accountability over this next decade going forward?
I think here on accountability, we also go back to the local to global linkages. And for us, it starts at sub-national level. It starts from the very, the planning process of municipalities and the participation that citizens can have in there, so that they can establish the baseline of what is going to be implemented, so that then there can be an accountability continuum. So for us, accountability is not just about demanding or finger pointing at something that hasn't been done, but it's also about establishing what we would say is a very basic baseline, which is the commitments, which is the planning process at municipality and local level, and cascaded up, to the national level. So I think again, it starts with the national and subnational planning process, and how that is going to be implemented, and how civil society and citizens participate on that. And quite agree with you that it's not only about the report. And yes, at global level, we do focus on the report because it's places it's like a window into what is happening at national, or what is not happening at national or subnational level. But again, looking at it as a starting point from the local to global.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we often encounter when it comes to talking about accountability, a lot of governments have a resistance to the A word, accountability. We often hear from governments that this is a voluntary agenda, and therefore accountability is difficult when it amounts to a voluntary agenda. But then also we hear from governments sometimes that it's not really productive to be, finger pointing and naming and shaming. So I think one of the things that we also have to think about when it comes to accountability for the SDGs is, how do we make that pitch for why accountability is actually meaningful, and why it's kind of, we put it in a more positive narrative, where we say, it's not about finger pointing. It's not about naming and shaming your government. It's about collectively coming together to identify where we are in the implementation of the SDGs in a particular country or context, and saying, we're all in this together. It should be in our own best interest, whether you're a government or civil society. It should be in our best interest to find out where we are, hold ourselves accountable to it, and hold a government accountable to it, and then say, this is how we improve. And I think that's one of the things that's lacking from the VNR process, is that it's largely focused on reporting on where we are, which is useful, but not as much focused on concretely what are governments going to do to improve progress in areas that they haven't been doing so well in. It's first about being honest about where we are in terms of progress, but then having the humility to actually say, okay, we may be struggling in this particular area, but here are ways that we can do, or things that we can do to improve the situation in this context. So I think also making sure that we're crafting a narrative that civil society isn't seen as the opposition. It's saying we have a joint interest in holding each other accountable to ensure that we ultimately achieve the SDGs, which theoretically, government, civil society, everyone should be in the same boat in trying to achieve the SDGs by 2030. So I think that's one of the challenges that we always face as civil society, is this light that governments often see us in as the opposition, the ones that are always there to make them look bad. And I think that's couldn't be farther from the truth in terms of the SDGs, where it comes to this is voluntary. We're all in this together and pushing towards the same objectives. Accountability is a joint endeavor here, and we should all have an interest in it for that reason. So there's a lot of work.
I think governments really need to start looking at accountability as something that they actually themselves plan for. When they develop the national development plans, they establish KPIs. They establish their, as part of their planning process, they establish their scorecard. So accountability is exactly that. It's looking at what has been registered under that scorecard, and review and analyze where are the gaps. So it's something that actually contributes to their assessment and to their review, and particularly if it comes with recommendations on how it can be done better. Because I think that from our perspective, from civil society, we should not only identify the gaps, but we should always be very prompt to also identify solutions, so that it can be a much more complete assessment of the gaps when you identify the solutions that can work, can be put in place to reach the goals.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think with all of that, I think we've actually come full circle here. We started out talking about governance and the processes and institutions and transparency and the need for all of these things in the context of SDG 16, to now coming back and saying that governments need to have strong institutions and governance systems in order to actually prepare to report and hold themselves accountable to the SDGs. So I think this is a perfect spot to end on, where we've literally come full circle in this conversation.
Exactly.
So thanks again, Arelys. I'm sure we could talk for hours about all of these issues that we talked about. We could unpack and talk for hours on. So I appreciate your useful insights as always, and your dedication to SDG 16 and the 2030 agenda, and of course to the TAP network. We'll have much more of these in the months ahead as well. So for those of you that are watching and are members of the TAP network, please do reach out. We want to hear from you as well. You know, this is an opportunity for us to showcase the insights and the contributions from TAP partners like World Vision and of course Arelys. But we want to ensure that, you know, as a platform, as a network, we want to bring your voices to the front. So please do reach out. If you find this useful and helpful, please do let us know as well. But thanks again, Arelys, for your time. And of course, as always, we look forward to working a lot more closely with you in the months and years ahead. So
thank you so much, John.
And hope you're well and maintaining good health and sanity in these crazy times.
Yes, likewise, very much needed.
Yeah, great. So that's it for us. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we look forward to bringing you more of these in the months.